do want to start by acknowledging that this was really science and a team effort. It was the first time I've really done it, and it's been exciting. And that's why I have Megan McKenna and TJ Moore right here on my first slide, because they were equal partners in developing the methods and really crunching the numbers. And then I put my acknowledgement second, because this is the rest of the team. And it's a bunch of folks from the panel, John and Monica and Jay, and then also folks at the Southwest Center. And they've been involved in helping me with the habitat modeling or processing data, or they've been chief scientists on our cruises out there collecting the data, without which we couldn't do any of these analyses. I'm stuck. There we go. Thank you. So I want to start by pointing out our study areas. With the AIS data, we can say, we can talk about ship traffic patterns in this small region, but to develop whale habitat models to really get at fine-scale predictions of density, I needed a larger sample size, and so that's why my study area for the whale habitat modeling was a bit larger. So I want to start by showing you a bit about our whale survey effort. We have the different years we've surveyed here along the bottom, and then it's broken out by month. And one of the first things you'll notice is that we had quite a lot of effort in 2009, and that's because we had a dedicated fine-scale sampling cruise. And when I'm talking about a composite of whale density hotspots from 1991 through 2009, I've done an effort-weighted average. So I'm really weighting the 2009 data quite heavily, and so our results are most meaningful for these recent time periods that we're going to be talking about. Another point is our effort occurs from July 29th through December 6th. So really, the time period I can tell you about meaningfully is August through November. And I just want everyone to keep that in mind. Also, our distribution of month, it does vary by year, but generally we're seeing a spread across the whole time period. To build the habitat models, I'm using an approach that we've developed and we've been using for several years now to get at these fine-scale predictions. So we break up our transect lines into approximately 5-kilometer segments. That's where we're summarizing our whale sighting data. I also use oceanographic data that we collected during the cruise, and to get that spread throughout the study area, we're using kriging. And so here's an example of maps for just 2 variables, mixed layer depth, and you can see it's shallower close to the shore and it's getting deeper offshore, and surface chlorophyll with higher concentrations here in the northwest. Then we use generalized additive models, and we choose those over generalized linear models because they're letting the data tell us about non-linearities in the habitat relationships. I'm modeling number of individuals, and we expect that to have an over-dispersed Poisson distribution, so I'm correcting for that with a quasi-likelihood distribution. I'm using cubic smoothing splines with up to 3 degrees of freedom, and I do that so that the models have some flexibility in capturing the patterns, but if I give it more degrees of freedoms, we could get a lot of bends and wiggles that are very difficult to interpret ecologically and probably aren't meaningful. And finally, the variables were selected for inclusion in the models using a forward, backward, stepwise approach in AIC. And so here are the results. The habitat models that I put in are on the bottoms. We have, I'm going to start here with depth, sea surface temperature, sea surface salinity, mixed layer depth, and then I'm taking the natural log of chlorophyll just because there's a wide range in those values. I also put in this term year here, and I didn't give it an option of selecting that. I forced that fit for all of the whale species, and I did that because Jay was showing you that we have some abundance changes throughout this time period. And you can see we're capturing, Jay talked about the increase for fin whales, and so here, this is from 1991 through 2009. You can see that increase in number of individuals through time, and we've also picked up that decrease in blue whales over time, and then our flat pattern for humpback whales. Depth also came in for fin whales and blue whales. And then the variable that was quite important for all 3 species was mixed layer depth. Had usually a pretty strong effect, although the patterns are different for the 3 species. Also chlorophyll concentrations. And so if you take these results and you use them to predict across the study area that smooth oceanographic data and you average, here's what we're seeing. So we have fin whales here, and we're getting a hot spot of density in the southwestern part of the study area. The black dots you're seeing on the graph are actual sightings, and they're scaled by the number of individuals in the sighting. The white dots, they're faint, but they're just meant to show you the effort. And an important thing is there's a little gap in our effort that we have here. It's right in the fin whale hotspot, and so Our interpolation of oceanography is suggesting that is habitat where we might expect them, but we haven't searched for them there very much. Humpback whales, we're doing a good job of picking up the fact that we're just at the southern edge of their distribution here, so we're just getting them in the very northern part of our study area. Now, we're doing a pretty good job for fin whales and humpback whales. Some of us on the panel, we're still working on these blue whale models. They're showing a little bit more of a spread throughout the study area. We're getting a hot spot here in the north and some in the south. And we're getting relatively lower densities in the channel. And John is going to show you some of his work he's done on a finer scale in the channel, which shows some blue whale concentrations there that our models may be missing. So we're going to, I'll talk to you a little bit in the end about how we're going to revise these models to see if we can pick up some of those patterns in a better manner. And what's going to come out throughout this talk is the fact that the hot spots for fin whales and humpback whales are opposite. So you'll want to keep that in mind when we look at risk. Another important point is this is a very dynamic area. We might expect habitat to be changing. And so what I've done is I've used our oceanography data collected each year, and I've predicted our whale densities just to show you hotspots. My hotspots here are defined as the largest 25% of the values. So you can see for fin whales, we are generally seeing them in the south, but there's times when we see them shifted up north and more in the channel. And that's an important point. For blue whales, something that I think is interesting in their pattern, here in this middle row we have the data from 2001, 2005, and 2008. And you are seeing them concentrated more on the channel during that time period. And if you remember, that unusual mortality event was in 2007. So in this window when we were predicting, they would have been in the channel. And finally, for humpback whales, they are more concentrated in that northern region, but you can see some changes in how far across the channel they're spread and when they shift south. So now I want to talk about risk, and I think it's really important that we start with how I've defined risk so you all know exactly what I'm talking about when I use that word. I have assumed that risk is proportional to ship density multiplied by whale density. And so what that's really saying is risk is going to be highest in the areas where the co-occurrence of ships and whales is the highest. Defining the proportionality in that relationship is more complicated and we need more information, and I'll come back to that at the end when I talk about future research. So I wanted to address three questions. First, I wanted to look at the change in risk associated with that change in shipping traffic from the CARB rule. I wanted to ask, what is the optimal shipping route? But I also wanted to look at how stable the route was given that interannual variability in the whale densities. So this is just slides that Megan's already shown you, but just wanted to re-emphasize the point that basically in 2008, the traffic was primarily in the channel, and in 2009, we saw that shift south. So to look at that, we went ahead and generalized the traffic patterns. And what we did is we assumed all of the traffic was in the channel in 2008 and that everything was south in 2009, just to make it a little easier to tease apart. We did want the actual traffic patterns in those regions for the year, so we normalized it by taking the value, the actual kilometers traveled in the grid cell, and dividing it by the sum of the values in all the grid cells in a region, so that basically the values in each region sum to 1. And so you could actually bring real ship traffic back into this just by multiplying by what it was to get risk numbers. But right now we're kind of thinking about more normalized risk. I did the same with whale density, so everything was on the same scale. And then my calculation of risk was to sum the normalized whale density multiplied by the normalized ship density. And this is what the results are for the percentage change in risk between traffic patterns in 2008 and 2009. So when you see a positive number here, which we have for fin whales, that's showing a really large increase in risk when they shifted south. And that makes sense because the fin whale hotspot is down south. If we look at humpback whales here, we're seeing a decrease in risk, and that absolutely makes sense. When you move south, you're moving out of their hotspot. Now, there's not much of a change in blue whales, but I'm not going to focus on that as much because those are the ones we're a little bit more concerned about the models when we want to revisit those habitat models. And then I wanted to look at the alternate shipping routes. So this is that example from south of the channel that Megan just showed with the lines. And so we just tried to draw some idealized lines through here. We made the width of the line 1 nautical mile, which is the width of the shipping lanes. And then we wanted to see if we could look at fine scale variability in the channel, so we drew 4 lines. We kind of captured this southern pattern by a broad fan pattern. There are some alternate routes we put in as well, and then some of these different patterns that we saw occurring. Risk in this instance, I was only looking at the whale density, so it's kind of a single ship passing through, and you could simply take the value of risk I'm getting here and multiply it by the number of ships. But I summed the normalized whale densities in each line, and I divided by the length of the line, so it'd be comparable. And here are the results. So what you can see for fin whales, again, it matches those distribution patterns. Low risk is shown in green, higher risk is shown in red. And so for fin whales, it'd be better if you traveled in the channel. But then you look down at humpback whales, and the risk is much higher if you're in the travel. So it's really tricky to think about those two species. And then for blue whales, we're seeing a general spread of risk across the area. Another point I want to make with these is you can see that within the channel, we drew 4 lines because we wanted to try to look at the fine scale variability. But my risk values are all really similar for those lines. And what that says is that my whale data is not collected at a resolution that's fine enough to really let me look at those fine scale differences. But what I can talk about meaningfully is differences between sort of what's going on in the channel and what's going on south of the islands. And then the optimal routes for fin and humpbacks are opposite. Blues are more generally at risk, given what our current model is saying. But if we look at this, if you wanted to kind of optimize across all of your species, these routes that are just south of the Channel Islands may be the best for all of them. So given that we have this kind of narrower line south of the islands might be best, I wanted to revisit that question of what's the effect of traffic if it's all in the channel or if it's all south. And I wanted to contrast, what if it is in that kind of broad southern pattern? What would it change if you made it a narrower region and further north in that area? For this, I had to assume traffic was normally distributed because I don't have actual traffic patterns in that small northern sliver. Here, risk was, again, the sum of the normalized whale density multiplied by the normalized ship density. And I thought these results were quite interesting. So the dark orange bars are that broad southern pattern, and that's basically the same as what you saw before. But now the light orange is that narrow band in the south. And so what you can see is we still have an increased risk for fin whales, but it's not nearly as large an increase. And that's because you're starting to go through the slightly lower density fin whale areas in the north, or just south of the islands. Not much of a change again for blue whales, and not much of an impact for fin whales for narrowing it. And I want to, my last set of slides here are on the interannual variability, because I think this really is a critical point to keep in mind because it's such a dynamic region. So again, these are just maps looking at the alternate routes. Greens is low risk, yellow moderate, red high. And so you can see for fin whales, we're almost always in greens or yellows in the channel, but we do have this one outlying year, 1996, where the risk was really high in the channel. You can see blue whales, I think, are quite interesting. I think this might be a pattern, a true pattern we are picking up. This is the 2001 through 2008 period again, and that's where in the channel you had that really high risk. And then finally for humpback whales, again, usually the red risk high in the channel, but there is this one year, 1996, where they have shifted south, and so you've got an increased risk on those lines that we would have said would have been optimal. So our preliminary conclusions that we can draw from this: the changes in the shipping traffic caused by the carb rule, it increased the risk for fin whales, and it decreased the risk for humpback whales. Currently, our results are showing little impact on blue whales, but we want to revisit that. I think that's one where we may be able to improve the models and look at that in a little more detail. It looks like risk may be minimized across all species in routes just south of the Channel Islands, but whale distributions change each year. And so when I'm looking at this risk, I'm able to say that over a long time period, I'm looking at 1991 through 2009, risk could be minimized for a narrower route just south of the Channel Islands. But in any individual year, you can still have a large number of ship strikes, and I think that's the complexity in trying to work in this region. And I do want to end with pointing out future research. We were able to evaluate large-scale differences in risk from August to November. We're missing an important part of the year. For example, I haven't talked about gray whales at all, and they are at risk of the ship strikes, but we don't have the data to analyze that because we don't have that time period covered. We also think it would be very important to explore distance to shelf edge in our habitat models, and that could really be a key for potentially improving the blue whale models. I'm not sure it's going to affect our fin and humpbacks much. I think those patterns are going to be pretty robust, but we may be able to improve the blue whales. We also need to explore options to minimize risk within the channel. And to do that, we're going to need different kinds of data. It might be good to conduct some systematic fine-scale surveys in the channel. John is going to be talking next about his work doing non-systematic surveys, and I think bringing some of that data into the analysis is a pretty critical next step. Finally, going back to my assumption of risk, that risk is proportional to ship density multiplied by whale density. Well, I think we'd all really like to be able to take that risk number and say, okay, what does that actually mean for ship strikes? And to do that, we have to have more information. And some of the things we should be looking at are determining how whales are using different areas. So is it an area where they're tending to spend more time at the surface, so the risk of a strike is greater, or where they're deep diving and maybe not at the surface as much and risk is lower? And to get at that, we can use tagging data. And there's quite a suite of tagging data, from tags that give you large-scale information to that which will give you fine-scale sort of behavioral information, and John will cover that in more detail in his talk. And then finally, it'd be nice to determine what levels of co-occurrence, or our metric of risk, result in ship strikes. I think one thing that'd be really interesting to do is to start to go back, that data Monica showed, of how the risk is varying over each year, and relate that to our risk measure and see how we're doing. And I think that's going to be potentially very helpful, because Monica showed yesterday there was a really high incident of ship strikes for fin whales in 2009. Well, we would have predicted that given the changes in the shipping pattern in the fin whale density hotspots. That's all I have. Thank you.
Have you actually looked at ship strikes to see if they agree with your model predictions? And given the low number, relative low number of ship strikes, how would you validate your models? Or how could you validate your models?
I think we haven't taken that step yet. The next step really is to go to the ship strike database and look at our metric of risk, just summarized over this time period, and say, okay, how well does it match? But you know, the fin whales in 2009, we would have had that, so that's a good sign. I think more detailed exploration, that's something I'd really like to do. We didn't collect data in 2007. That was when we had the unusual mortality event for the blue whales. But we've got some ocean circulation models that are starting to really do a good job at capturing patterns. It'd be nice to look at 2007 predictions from those and our predicted habitat to see, okay, would we have predicted the blue whales in the channel and those high events? So I think there are some ways to move forward to validate those models.